Ava Reyes had hiked Miller's Ridge Trail perhaps a dozen times over the past 3 years. Enough times that she'd stopped bothering to check the weather forecast with any real care before setting out, trusting instead the particular confidence of someone who'd never yet encountered a problem on that familiar stretch of mountain that her own reasonable caution and modest experience couldn't handle. She should have checked the forecast that particular Saturday in October. The morning had started clear and mild, exactly the kind of crisp autumn day that had drawn her out to the trailhead before dawn, wanting to catch the sunrise from the ridge's exposed summit before the day's later hikers crowded the popular overlook with their noise and their selfie sticks. She'd made good time on the ascent, reached the summit with nearly 20 minutes to spare before the sun cleared the eastern peaks, and had been standing there, coffee thermos in hand, entirely unprepared for the speed with which the weather turned against her. The clouds had rolled in from the northwest with a suddenness that even her limited mountain experience recognized as unusual. A wall of gray moving across the valley below with a pace that left her scrambling to pack her gear and start her descent before the storm's leading edge actually reached her exposed position. She hadn't made it far enough down before the first hard gusts hit, carrying with them a cold rain that turned, within 20 minutes, to sleet. And then, as she continued her increasingly difficult descent along a trail growing slicker and less certain beneath her boots, to a wet, heavy snow that accumulated with alarming speed across terrain she'd never once seen in anything beyond ordinary autumn conditions. She fell somewhere past the trail's steepest switchback section, a misstep on rock that had gone from merely wet to properly treacherous in the space of perhaps 20 minutes, and the twisted ankle that resulted, combined with what she suspected, from the particular way her wrist had struck the rock during her fall, might be a fracture rather than a simple sprain, transformed a manageable bad-weather hike into something considerably more dangerous. She was perhaps 4 miles from the trailhead, with no cell signal, a storm showing no sign of easing, and an injury severe enough that continuing her descent under her own power seemed, with each passing minute of cold and pain, less like a difficult challenge and more like a genuine impossibility. She had been sitting against a rock outcropping for what felt like hours, though her phone's dead battery made it impossible to properly track the actual passage of time. Working through the particular calculations of a person beginning to understand that hypothermia, rather than the injury itself, represented the more immediate threat to her survival, when she heard, through the storm's steady roar, the sound of footsteps approaching along the trail. The man who appeared through the sleet and snow moved with an ease across the treacherous terrain that suggested either considerable local knowledge or considerable natural sure-footedness, dressed in layers that looked practical rather than expensive, a weathered pack on his shoulders that suggested he'd been out in this particular stretch of mountain for reasons that had nothing to do with the same recreational hiking that had brought Ava out that morning. He crouched beside her without introduction, checking her ankle and her wrist with quick, careful hands that spoke of genuine practical experience rather than simple first-aid course training, and asked her only the immediately necessary questions. Could she feel her fingers and toes? Did she have any pain beyond the ankle and wrist? Had she hit her head at any point during the fall? Said, once his quick assessment had apparently satisfied whatever immediate concerns he'd been checking for. The trailhead's too far in this weather, with your ankle the way it is. There's a place I know, closer, where we can get you warm and properly looked at. Can you put any weight at all on that ankle? A little, Ava managed, her voice unsteady with cold, and the particular disorientation of someone who'd spent the past hour genuinely uncertain whether help would arrive before the storm, and her own deteriorating condition combined into something considerably worse than a twisted ankle and a possible fracture. Not much. I don't think I can walk 4 miles on it, even with help. You won't need to, the man said. Not to the trailhead anyway. Different direction, shorter distance, though it won't be an easy carry given the terrain in this weather. I'm going to need to carry you most of the way. Are you all right with that? Ava, understanding with a clarity that cut through even her considerable pain and cold, that she had genuinely no better option available to her, nodded, and the man lifted her with a careful, practiced motion that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd carried an injured person across difficult terrain. Settling her weight against his shoulders in a configuration that balanced his own need to navigate the treacherous footing against her injured ankle's need to remain as undisturbed as possible. What followed was, by any reasonable measure, one of the strangest and most physically demanding experiences of Ava's entire life. Hour after hour of the man carrying her steadily through steadily worsening weather, along a route that clearly wasn't any marked trail she'd previously encountered on her dozen prior hikes through this particular mountain range, stopping only occasionally to rest and to check, with the same careful, practical attention he'd shown from their first encounter, that her condition wasn't deteriorating beyond what the difficult journey could reasonably account for. She tried, across those long hours, to properly thank him, to understand something of who he was and why he happened to be out on that particular stretch of mountain in weather severe enough that she'd encountered no other hikers whatsoever during her entire ascent and the beginning of her aborted descent. He answered her questions about the terrain, about the weather, about the particular route he was navigating, with evident local knowledge, readily enough. But when she asked, somewhere past the 4th hour of their difficult journey, what his name was, he simply said, "Doesn't matter right now. Let's focus on getting you somewhere warm." She thought little of the deflection in the moment, attributing it to the practical urgency of their situation, the storm's continued severity making conversation itself a considerable effort against the wind and cold. It was only later, considerably later, that she would understand exactly how deliberate that evasion had actually been. The shelter he eventually brought her to, some 12 hours after he'd first found her on that treacherous stretch of trail, proved to be a modest but solidly built cabin tucked into a fold of the mountainside that Ava understood, even in her exhausted, pain-addled state, she would never have found on her own, isolated enough from any marked trail that she suspected few people beyond its owner had ever properly located it. He got a fire going with practiced efficiency, wrapped her properly against the cold, and examined her ankle and wrist with a thoroughness that convinced her, watching him work, that whatever his actual profession might be, it had equipped him with medical knowledge considerably beyond basic first aid. "Wrist isn't broken," he said, after careful examination. "Bad sprain, but the bone's intact. Ankle's worse. I think you've got a small fracture, though I can't be entirely certain without proper imaging. Either way, you shouldn't be walking on it for a while, and you need to get to a hospital once this storm clears enough to make the trip back down safely." "Thank you," Ava said, meaning it with a depth that felt inadequate to the actual scale of what he'd done for her, carrying her across 12 hours of increasingly difficult terrain in worsening weather, at what she understood must have been considerable physical cost to himself as well. "I mean that. You saved my life today. I don't know how to properly thank someone for that." "You don't need to thank me," he said, something in his tone carrying a weight that suggested this wasn't simply modest deflection, but something considerably more complicated. "Just get yourself properly looked after once we can get you down safely." The storm held through that night, and Ava found herself, across the following hours of enforced proximity by his small fire, growing increasingly curious about a man who moved through his own home with a careful, guarded economy that suggested someone considerably more accustomed to solitude than to hosting an injured stranger. "Can I at least know your name?" she asked, some time past what she estimated was midnight, the fire's warmth finally beginning to properly counter the deep cold her hours of exposure had settled into her body. "Seems only fair." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire with an expression she found genuinely difficult to read. "It's better if you don't know," he said finally. "Better for who?" Ava asked, genuine confusion overriding whatever exhaustion might otherwise have kept her from pressing the question further. "I don't understand. You rescued me. You carried me for 12 hours through a blizzard. Why would knowing your name possibly be a problem? It's complicated, he said, in a tone that made clear he wasn't prepared to elaborate further, regardless of how reasonable her confusion might be. I'd rather you just focus on getting yourself properly recovered. Once this storm clears, I'll help you get back down to where you can get proper medical care and proper transportation home. Ava let the matter rest for that night, understanding, from the particular firmness in his tone, that continued pressing wasn't likely to yield any different answer. But she found herself, across the following 2 days the storm's severity kept them isolated together at his cabin, growing increasingly determined to understand exactly what circumstance might make a man's own name something he felt compelled to withhold from a woman whose life he'd just saved at considerable cost to himself. She noticed across those 2 days small details that only deepened her curiosity rather than resolving it. A stack of old newspapers, kept rather than used as kindling, despite the practical value firewood would seem to offer over paper storage in a remote cabin. A framed photograph, turned face down on a shelf rather than displayed, that she glimpsed only briefly while he was occupied elsewhere in the cabin. The particular careful way he avoided any direct answer whenever her questions edged toward his own history or circumstances, redirecting instead toward practical matters of her recovery, or the storm's gradually improving conditions. It was on the 3rd day, the storm finally clearing enough, that he judged the trail passable for the difficult journey back down to where she could receive proper medical attention. Then Ava, working up considerable courage against his evident reluctance, asked the question that had been building across their 2 days of enforced proximity. "I'm not leaving this mountain without at least understanding why you won't tell me your name," she said, meeting his gaze with a steadiness she drew from the same resolve that had gotten her through 12 hours of pain and cold during their initial journey. "You don't have to tell me everything, but I need to understand at least this much before I go back down to whatever ordinary life is waiting for me, and you go back to whatever solitary existence you're apparently determined to protect." He studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his careful, guarded expression, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that told her, even before he explained further, that whatever answer he was about to give would prove considerably more significant than she had anticipated. "Because if you go down this mountain and mention my name to anyone in town," he said, "you're going to find out something that's going to make you doubt everything you just experienced up here. And I'd rather you have some time to process what actually happened before that particular complication enters the picture." "What complication?" Ava asked, a chill working through her that had nothing to do with the cabin's cold morning air. "My name," he said quietly, "is Marcus Deering, and according to every official record in the county below, Marcus Deering has been dead for going on 3 years now." Ava sat with this revelation for a long moment, the fire crackling between them, working through a disbelief that felt, given everything else she'd experienced across the preceding 3 days, considerably harder to process than her earlier confusion about his simple reluctance to share his name. "That's not possible," she said finally, though even as she said it, she understood the flimsiness of the objection, given the solid, undeniably physical reality of the man sitting across from her, who had, beyond any reasonable doubt, carried her across 12 hours of treacherous mountain terrain and tended her injuries with genuine, practical skill across the following days. "I understand why you'd think that," Marcus said, something old and tired entering his voice. "I've had 3 years to think about how to explain it myself, and I still don't have an answer that sounds entirely reasonable, even to my own ears." "Then explain it anyway," Ava said, "because I've spent 3 days trusting you with my life, and I think I've earned at least an attempt at an explanation, however strange it turns out to be." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, and when he finally began speaking, his voice carried the particular careful weight of a story he'd apparently told himself, silently, many times over the preceding years, without ever once having the opportunity to speak it aloud to another living person. "I was working a survey job 3 years back," he said, "mapping some old mining claims further up this range, alone, the way I usually worked. There was an accident. A section of old mine shaft I was surveying collapsed while I was inside it, and by any reasonable account, I should have died there, buried under considerable rock and earth, with no way for anyone to know where to look for me, since my work that particular week hadn't been properly logged with anyone who might have organized a search." "But you survived," Ava said, though it came out more as a question than a statement, given the evident impossibility of what he was describing. "I don't fully understand how, myself. I was trapped for what I estimate must have been the better part of a week, injured badly enough that I have only fragmented memories of much of that time, surviving on nothing but whatever moisture I could find seeping through the collapsed rock, and whatever will I had left in me not to simply give up. By the time I finally managed to dig myself free, weeks had passed since anyone had last had any contact with me, and the search that had apparently been mounted once my absence became noticed had already been called off, my death presumed based on the mine shaft's evident collapse and the considerable time that had passed without any sign of me." "So you were declared dead," Ava said slowly, "while you were actually still alive, trapped underground. By the time I made it back to any kind of civilization," Marcus continued, "months had passed. I'd lost considerable weight, changed enough in appearance that the first few people who saw me genuinely didn't recognize me at first. And when I finally tried to explain what had happened, to reclaim my own identity and my own life, I found the process considerably more complicated than I'd naively assumed it would be." "Why?" Ava asked. "Surely there's some legal process for exactly this kind of situation, however unusual it might be." "There is," Marcus said, "but by the time I was ready to properly navigate that process, my death had already been legally finalized. My modest savings had been distributed according to my will to a sister I hadn't spoken to in years, my property sold to settle outstanding debts, my professional licenses lapsed and reassigned. Reclaiming my legal identity would have meant unwinding years of legal and financial consequences that had already, by that point, settled into their own considerable complexity, consequences that would have genuinely harmed people who'd already in good faith moved forward with the assumption of my death." "Your sister," Ava said carefully, "you'd have taken back an inheritance she'd already received." "Among other complications," Marcus said, "I spent considerable time in those first months after I emerged from that mine shaft, trying to decide whether reclaiming my old life was actually worth the harm it would cause to people who'd already properly grieved and moved forward. Eventually I made the decision that it wasn't. I built this cabin using skills and knowledge from my old survey work that I could apply without needing any official identity or credentials. I've lived here, quietly, for the better part of 3 years now, understanding that Marcus Deering, for all practical and legal purposes, genuinely did die in that mine shaft, even if the man who once carried that name happened to physically survive the experience." Ava sat with this remarkable account for a long while, working through the particular vertigo of understanding that the man who had saved her life, carried her across 12 hours of brutal mountain terrain, existed, in every official sense the modern world recognized, as someone who no longer existed at all. "That's why you wouldn't tell me your name," she said finally, understanding beginning to properly settle, "because you knew that once I went back down this mountain and mentioned it to anyone, questions would start. Questions you've spent 3 years deliberately avoiding." "I've built a life up here that works," Marcus said. "Quiet, solitary, but genuinely peaceful in ways I don't think I properly appreciated before the accident. I wasn't prepared for those 12 hours carrying you down this mountain to become the reason that carefully built peace finally comes apart." Ava spent that final night at the cabin, working through the considerable weight of what Marcus had shared, understanding that whatever gratitude she owed him for her rescue now carried alongside it a genuine responsibility toward the fragile, carefully constructed peace he'd built for himself across 3 years of deliberate isolation. "I won't tell anyone your name," she said the following morning, as he prepared to guide her down the now clearing trail toward the point where she could arrange proper transportation and medical care. "Not because I think you're wrong to want privacy, but because I understand now exactly what you'd be risking if I did." "I appreciate that," Marcus said, something in his careful, guarded expression easing slightly at her assurance. "Though I understand if you feel some obligation to properly report what happened up here, to whatever authorities might need to know a stranger saved your life on this mountain." "I'll say a hiker helped me," Ava said. "That's true enough, as far as it goes. I don't need to give them a name you're not prepared to have circulated." They made the difficult journey down together, Marcus once again carrying the bulk of her weight across the trail's most treacherous sections, and Ava found herself, across those final hours of their shared journey, working through a growing conviction that she wasn't prepared to simply let this remarkable, complicated man disappear back into his solitary mountain existence without some continued connection between them. "I want to come back," she told him, once they'd finally reached the point where a rescue vehicle, summoned once she'd regained cell signal, waited to carry her the remainder of the way to proper medical care. "Not to expose your secret, just to know you're all right up there, to maybe understand more of what you've built for yourself once I'm properly healed and this isn't complicated by my own injury." Marcus considered this for a long moment, old caution visibly warring with something that looked, to Ava's careful observation, like genuine hope for exactly the kind of continued connection she was suggesting. "I've spent 3 years assuming that connection to my old life, however modest, would always risk unraveling everything I've carefully built up here. But I confess, these past 3 days, having someone to talk to beyond my own solitary thoughts, have reminded me of things about ordinary human connection I'd convinced myself I no longer needed." "So is that a yes?" Ava asked, allowing herself a small, hopeful smile despite her exhaustion and pain. "That's a yes," Marcus said, "carefully, and on my own terms, regarding what I'm prepared to share with anyone beyond yourself. But yes." The months that followed brought a careful, gradually deepening friendship between them, Ava returning to the mountain periodically once her ankle had properly healed, learning through patient, respectful conversation considerably more about the 3 years of isolated life Marcus had built for himself following his remarkable, unlikely survival. She never told anyone his name, understanding, more thoroughly with each visit, exactly how much genuine peace his careful isolation had provided him following an ordeal that would have broken most people considerably more completely than it apparently had broken him. It was nearly a year into their careful, evolving friendship, Ava having become one of perhaps only 2 or 3 people who knew both his true identity and the complicated legal reality of his official death, that Marcus finally raised, on his own initiative, the question of whether he might eventually consider properly reclaiming his identity, now that considerable time had passed and his sister, contacted carefully and anonymously through channels Ava helped him navigate, had indicated, through careful intermediary correspondence, that she would welcome the return of a brother she'd genuinely grieved, rather than resent whatever legal complications his return might create. "I don't know if I'm ready to fully rejoin the world I left behind," he told Ava, during one of her regular visits, the two of them sitting together by his cabin's familiar fire, nearly 18 months after that first remarkable rescue. "But I think, for the first time since that mineshaft collapsed, I'm genuinely considering whether Marcus Deering might deserve to properly exist again, rather than remaining simply a careful secret between the two of us." "Whatever you decide," Ava said, "I'll support it. But for what it's worth, I think the world could use a little more of whoever it is you've become up here, name or no name." Marcus reached for her hand, something settled and grateful in his expression that spoke to considerably more than simple friendship. And Ava found herself watching the fire's familiar warmth between them, genuinely glad that a twisted ankle and a sudden mountain storm had led her, quite by unlikely accident, toward a man whose careful, guarded secret had ultimately proven worth every bit of the trust it had taken both of them to properly share it.